Hello, everyone. This is Jenna Ovett. Thank you all for joining us for our Fall Leadership Circle Insight series. I am just going to go over a bit of housekeeping, and then I'm going to pass it over to Executive Director Dana Watts. Per usual, all of our participants are muted, so we can limit the background noise. However, if at any point you have a question, you can type it into the chat tab in the lower portion of your screen. And if at any point you're having technical difficulties, feel free to email me at jenna@lnt.org. Again, this is a moderated 45-minute conversation, which is a part of the Leadership Circle Insight series. And here is Executive Director Dana Watts.
Hello all, and welcome to the Leadership Circle Insight series. This is the wildlife edition for this fall. First and foremost, I want to thank all of you for joining us, our key advocates, supporters, donors, and friends of Leave No Trace. Your support is so critical to this movement, so I want to thank you for taking the time today. As many of you know, wildlife has always been an important piece of Leave No Trace and something that we talk a lot about. As more and more people get outside today, many times in pursuit of wildlife, to have an experience with wildlife, never has the topic been more important. And so with that, I am happy to have Ben Lawhon, our Education Director, joining us today to give more of a comprehensive overview of what that looks like for us at the Leave No Trace Center for Outdoor Ethics today. So without further ado, I will pass it on to Ben.
Thanks, Dana. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today to chat a bit about parks, protected areas, and the wildlife issues that many of them are facing these days. You obviously all are aware of what Leave No Trace is, but it never hurts just to recap what our mission is, and that is to teach people how to enjoy the outdoors responsibly. We often think of Leave No Trace as a framework for making good decisions about minimizing our individual but cumulative impacts on the outdoors. And certainly when you think about wildlife, this is a relevant framework to have. As more and more people visit parks and protected areas, the issues are mounting. Why is Leave No Trace so important, and perhaps more today than it's ever been? We're dealing with impacts in parks and protected areas, many of which are avoidable. And we oftentimes focus on people who are either uninformed or unskilled, or in some cases just careless. And we know that education can be an effective tool for influencing the decisions that people make in the outdoors. And so Leave No Trace really provides that foundational framework for making those good decisions. When we look at public land use in the U.S., the numbers just simply continue to go up every single year. Whether we're talking about federal lands managed by the 5 largest federal land management agencies, or we're talking about the state park system. Interesting enough, there are about 8,000 state parks in the U.S. Their visitation is hovering right at almost 800 million visits per year. So we're talking about a lot of people enjoying public lands, which is a great thing, but we're also talking about tremendous and increasing potential for impacts to public lands and wildlife in particular. So I want to talk briefly about some of the things that are leading to the increase in visitation that we're seeing on public lands. And one is certainly the role of social media and its specific influence. It's likely that you've seen news coverage about platforms like Instagram, for example. This is just a shot from a recent article asking, what are we doing to save wild places from Instagram? There's a sense that social platforms are counter to preservation of public lands. Instagram as a platform hosts 95 million pictures a day. 95 million new pictures a day are posted to Instagram worldwide. So we're talking a lot of volume in terms of what's being put out there. This is a shot of a location in Arizona called Horseshoe Bend that is one of the sort of poster child example for what happens when a place goes viral on social media platforms. Another example is this headline here that was in an article from just about a year ago, and the question was asked then, is geotagging, specifically marking locations with geotag on Instagram, ruining natural wonders? And if you look at the line just below the photograph, it says, sorry, Instagrammers, you're ruining Wyoming. And this is a shot from Grand Teton National Park. And so clearly social media is playing a role. It's certainly not the only thing that's driving visitation. There are other things. For example, the National Park Service and Department of Interior have had a plan to get every kid in the outdoors. So any fourth grader in the U.S. that wants to get a full parks pass for his or her family can do so for free, which is a great thing. We're getting more youth and families out in the outdoors, but there again, we're doing so in many cases without equipping these people with leave no trace information. And so while visitation is good, there's also an educational opportunity that we need to collectively capitalize on. There are also some other things that are driving visitation, some factors. One is, and if you look at reports specifically from the Department of Interior, they note that continued economic expansion since the Great Recession has really been a leading cause. People have more disposable income. During the recession, there were a lot of so-called staycations, and people really found out about some of the unique resources in terms of parks and protected areas they had close to home, and there has been a continued interest in visiting those places. Another factor is that international visitation to U.S. parks and protected areas continues to increase. 30% of all international travelers to the U.S. visit a national park. So 1 out of 3 every international visitor is also making a trip to a national park. We've had a number of anniversaries, high-profile anniversaries over the past couple of years that have been leading to increased visitation. 2016, we had the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service, and there was a significant push to get people into parks. Just last year was the 50th anniversary of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act and the National Trail System Act. And again, great things, incredible milestones, but leading to increased visitation. Another that we have recently been clued into in a more robust way is this notion of what the tourism industry refers to as a hub and spoke approach. So just increased availability of air travel coupled with the ease of rental cars. People fly from one major city to the next, and within a few hours or less, they can be from their home all of a sudden in a national park. And that sort of hub and spoke approach, while growing over time, has really become a big factor in this. And lastly, we have so many mobile technologies available at our disposal that allow for more do-it-yourself travel to parks and protected areas. And so, again, the combination of all these things are what are some of the key factors driving visitation. And so with that visitation comes increased impacts to wildlife in these places. This is an example from May of this year in California. An off-leash dog actually killed a threatened seal species in a national park. And so we've got threatened endangered species in many of our parks and protected areas. And this is just a case of someone out with their dog for a casual stroll, and an off-leash dog actually killed a threatened species. It's one example. This is another example, very recent. It's a video from Yellowstone National Park. Let me just preface this by saying that this 9-year-old girl ended up being okay. Miraculously, just some minor bruising, scratching, that sort of thing. But this is just an example of what can happen. This is simply a case of people being uninformed about how to act appropriately, how to keep an appropriate distance from a wild animal that may not seem like a threat, but you're talking about a 1,500-pound wild bison that can move very quickly. The Park Service, in the case of Yellowstone, has been trying to actively address these sorts of issues for many years, somewhat successfully, somewhat unsuccessfully. That shot right there and this one are both in recent years, where you have people that seemingly are making really poor decisions in our parks and protected areas, which can really dramatically affect the wildlife in these places. As you're seeing in this video, the Park Service is recommending staying at least 300 feet from bears, from wolves, and certainly from these larger animals like bison. Additionally, the Park Service is giving recommendations on how to safely view and how to safely conduct yourself around wildlife. Some of that reaches the visitors, not all of it does. And there's a significant role for Leave No Trace in this effort in terms of how we educate visitors. This is another short video here from Great Smoky Mountains National Park, which straddles the border of Tennessee and North Carolina. It's the most heavily visited national park in the system. Great Smoky sees about 10 million visitors a year. It's within a half a day's drive of 2/3 of the U.S. population. Interestingly enough, this park does not have an entrance fee. It's one of the few in the system that does not have an entrance fee, and therefore you don't have a touch point with every visitor that comes into the park. Great Smokies has a very high concentration of black bears in the park. About 2,000 black bears are found in the park. This is an example of what people do when they want to get too close. Either they don't understand what's going on, or they simply just make poor decisions. In this case, it's a mother and 2 cubs, and you'll see how this plays out here. Clearly, things could have turned out much differently than they did, but this is a prime example of park visitor behavior that has the ability to influence wildlife and to do so potentially in a negative way. If this individual had been successful at feeding those cubs, that could lead to much more significant problems in terms of food attraction and bears simply losing their fear of humans, which leads to much larger problems in many cases. So when we look at how recreation does, in fact, affect wildlife, there are a variety of things. This is a figure that was captured from some research that's been done over the years. A couple of folks, Rick Knight, David Cole, and many others have built on this work. But when we look at these types of recreational activities and the immediate wildlife response, those responses are not always good. Behavior change, we have altered behavior, altered productivity, and you can have the extreme, which would be death of an animal to an individual or a population or even a community. So this is more of a scientific view when we look at how the wildlife biology community looks at recreational activity and its cause, the change agents involved, the types of impact involved. There could be some significant acute issues as well as long-term changes in wildlife behavior because of recreation. There are also often thought to be 3 primary responses that wildlife have to recreation. Those are attraction behavior, avoidance behavior, and habituation. Habituation is often confused as meaning that animals are food conditioned. Habituation simply means that animals have lost or are lacking a response to a repeated stimulus. The problem occurs when we have wildlife that are used to being around people and then also become accustomed to people and the food they might provide or trash or other smellable items. That's where we really start to see issues when we get habituation with food conditioning. So what are the consequences to wildlife? Well, this is an example of a bear in Yosemite National Park in California. You can see on each ear he's got a tag, been tagged multiple times. If you look in the right-hand corner, that brown thing in the corner is the door to a bear locker that's been provided by the National Park Service. This is purely a human error. If that food had been locked in that bear canister, it would have been totally safe from that bear, but it was not locked properly or wasn't locked at all, and therefore this bear is rifling through someone's food, which obviously this bear has been food conditioned and is a problematic bear, and ultimately in a situation like this, the bear will be removed a couple of times, and then ultimately the bear is generally euthanized because we can't get this behavior out of this bear once it's accustomed to human foods and start to seek those things out actively. This is a couple of examples, a couple of shots of some more recent wildlife impacts, which to the uninformed, may not seem like much, but selfies with wild animals has become a big issue for parks and protected areas over the last couple of years. The shot on the left, that's a grizzly bear. Not very safe for that woman and very problematic for that bear. The one on the right is a bison, and as you just saw in that earlier video, they may seem slow and lumbering, but they can move very quickly. people want to get these shots. They see this on social media, they want to emulate and replicate this, and it just leads to more and more problems when people are uninformed about the consequences of these actions. Here's another shot, and this was a particularly interesting one from 2016. This is a mountain goat in the town of Seward, Alaska, that happened to wander into town, and essentially tourists that were getting off boats wanted a picture of this goat so bad that they literally chased this goat to the point where it jumped into the water and drowned because it couldn't get away from the hordes of people that simply wanted to photograph this animal. And this is a completely avoidable death of wildlife that, unfortunately people just didn't realize how close was too close, and the outcome obviously was fatal. So we, the center, have always had a component of our educational messaging that has focused on respecting wildlife. And conversely, for front country audiences, we've used the phrase "keep wildlife wild." But our basic guidance has always been to observe wildlife from a distance, to not feed, follow, or approach wildlife because of the issues that it causes. We specifically talk about not feeding wild animals, given that it exposes them to specific dangers to their own health. It can alter their natural behavior, and it exposes them to predators and other dangers. Another issue with feeding wildlife, particularly repetitively, is that it can lead to an unnatural congregation of wildlife that wouldn't naturally occur, and therefore you can start to have things like disease spread amongst the population. We also talk about protecting wildlife by storing food, rations, and other smellable items in trash securely. This is perhaps one of the biggest issues that we see that creates problems in parks and protected areas, not just for the megafauna like grizzly bears or black bears. More often than not, it's the smaller mammals that get into human foods, trash, and smellables that cause problems. And lastly, we talk about controlling pets at all times. Our animals in the outdoors, many of us like to recreate with our pets. They can have a significant impact on wildlife, and that's, again, something that's totally avoidable by just keeping our pets under control, on leash, or consider leaving them at home depending on where we're going. And the last piece is just avoiding wildlife at sensitive times. Mating, nesting, raising young. Winter can be a particularly stressful time for most wildlife. Here in the city of Boulder, there are annual closures, for example, for raptor nesting. So some of the popular climbing areas are closed off in certain times of the year to avoid these sensitive times like mating and nesting seasons. So this has been our guidance for many, many years, and though it's good, it's not reaching enough people, and that's one of the challenges that we face. So how are the federal agencies addressing wildlife? This is one example of a recent social media post by the National Park Service. And this one's pretty fascinating, very tongue-in-cheek, but they talk about observing wildlife in their native habitat, fun, thrilling, and educational experience. And if you look at this wildlife petting chart for bison, clearly they had someone very cleverly put this together. Think again, vacation over, do you have insurance? Ouch, nope, how fast? No. So this is a way that the Park Service is trying to sort of turn this issue on its head, really catch people's eye in a social media fashion, to help people understand the potential dangers, not only to themselves, but also to wildlife when people get too close. Here's another thing they're doing. This is a little more prescriptive in terms of saying, hey, if you want to photograph wildlife, here's how to do it safely. Use a telephoto lens, for example. Think about your location. Think about your distance. Take your time, share the view. That's one big problem that people have when they're trying to get that great shot. Sometimes, when you get these wildlife jams, as the Park Service calls them, where cars just randomly stop on the road, everybody jumps out, tries to get the great shot. Certain people can monopolize that opportunity. What that causes is people then try to come at these animals from different places, and they lose an escape route. And that's where we start to see a lot of issues that occur. When wildlife feel like they are trapped, they're backed in a corner, aggression can be the next step. And so, again, the Park Service is doing what they can to message to people, but there's certainly a role for us, the center, to play in this effort as these issues continue to pop up on public lands, parks and protected areas. So as most of you are likely aware, we are science-based. 7 principles are based in science. We are data-driven in terms of our output, our educational output. It's a critical part of the Leave No Trace program is being science-based. While it seems like common sense to most of us, having that scientific backing can really help improve the efficacy of all of our educational efforts. And so there's been posed this relationship between recreational use and recreational impact that posits this notion of as use increases, impact correspondingly increases as well. And, you know, after doing this for a long time, I'm not so certain that this is hypothetical. I think this is a real relationship that as more and more people spend time on public lands, the potential for impact does increase. And this is what we're trying to address, is how can we continue to educate more and more people so that we don't see increasing recreational impacts over time. When we look at how we influence behavior and how we influence the decisions that people make in the outdoors, there's thought to be 5 types of behaviors that really lead to most of the problems we see on public lands. We've got illegal actions, careless, unskilled actions, uninformed, and unavoidable actions. And when you look at the potential effectiveness of leave no trace, or just information in general, but specifically leave no trace information and education, we see that we really can be effective at addressing careless, unskilled, and uninformed actions. That's really where we are most successful in terms of educating visitors to public lands. And so when we think about how we can best create, craft, and structure our messages to reach those audiences, we then have to decide, well, what does success look like? So if we're going to try to reach the unformed, the unskilled, and the careless, what does success look like? And so the ultimate goal of Leave No Trace is obviously to influence the decisions that outdoor enthusiasts are making in the outdoors. And if we were to do that successfully, we might actually see a decrease in biophysical and social impacts. And there's some emerging research that shows that we are in fact actually seeing an empirical decrease in biophysical impacts to the landscape as a result of Leave No Trace. We might also see a decrease in maintenance needs. This would be a tremendous benefit to parks and protected areas, as most of our agencies, from local municipalities to states to federal lands, are just cash-strapped and they're under-resourced. And so to be able to experience a decrease in maintenance needs would be a big win. Another one would be to see an improvement in resource and social conditions. Conditions are actually improving on the ground as a result of Leave No Trace programming, education, outreach. And the last one would be to see an increase in visitor satisfaction. The reason that's important is it would help bring more champions to parks and protected areas. If people have a better time in parks, they're more likely to put their shoulder to the wheel, to help out that park, to become a volunteer, to donate money, to provide assistance, lend a hand. And so these are all some success measures that we are experiencing in a lot of places, but we'd like to see it on a much larger scale. So on that note, and thinking about the unskilled, the uninformed, and the careless actions we're trying to address, this is just a slide showing various ways that we reach people. And, you know, we use media and websites and social media and word of mouth and through our land management partners and our traveling trainers and signage on site. And it's just a variety of different ways that we're reaching people in order to have the most effect that we can in terms of influencing decisions that are made in the outdoors. So we are science-based, and we rely on the science of a lot of folks that are out there in academia and within the federal agencies doing research, but we, the center, do our own research as well. And the types of studies that we're doing, this is a study from 2011 that's been really influential in our messaging. This one specifically looked at influences on behavior in national parks. And we've done a similar study in state parks. We've done a similar study on Forest Service lands. And the upshot of this study is that we now know that explaining the why behind Leave No Trace, why shouldn't you get too close to that bison? Why shouldn't you feed those chipmunks? Why should you store your food properly? We know that's an important driver of behavioral intention. And so to message towards that is a way to strengthen the Leave No Trace messaging. And so these are the types of studies that we're conducting that are helping us strengthen the message that we're giving to visitors. That said, in terms of wildlife and respecting wildlife, there are 2 primary studies that we have on our radar that we are, one of which we're working through the proposal right now. The other, we actually have a proposal, but we're looking for funding for these types of studies. One is looking at attitudes and perceptions of food storage practices in bear country. We want to use a theory-driven approach to understand and predict behavior in visitors. And we have looked at backcountry and wilderness. What we really want to look at is more of how are people storing their food properly in the front country, in parks that have bear populations. And this could be places like Shenandoah or the Great Smokies, or it could be big western parks like Grand Teton, Yellowstone, Yosemite. But the idea here is that we're seeing a lot of issues in front country, in parks, where food storage facilities are provided by the federal agencies or state agencies in some cases, but people aren't using these. There's a prime example in the Tetons. There's a lake called String Lake, and it's a fascinating example of a place where people come early season. It's a shallow lake. It thaws out quickly. It's beautiful. It's right under the Tetons, and everybody loves to take their stand-up paddleboard on the lake. But when they get out of their cars and they walk down to the lake, there are large food storage boxes that are not being utilized. So people just drop their backpacks right on the shore and paddle out on the lake, and bears wander in and get access to human foods very quickly and easily. And so we're trying to figure out, why are people not using the facilities that are provided in these types of settings? So that's one study that we are very interested in undertaking because of the benefits it would provide, the actionable items, the real practitioner-focused outcomes of a study like this that our federal and state partners are so interested in. And the second one is looking at, through an experimental design study, how close is too close to wildlife? This study is being proposed to do in Grand Teton National Park, specifically looking at the issue of bison, because people want to get close to these animals. And what we're trying to figure out through an experimental design study is, what are people's perceptions of how close is too close, or how close they can actually get before it poses a problem? And so our intention is to run this study next summer in the Tetons. We're working with a graduate or a PhD candidate at Penn State University. But this is the type of study that, again, would have very applied findings for land managers. And so the center has been actively engaging in studies like this that are have a very applied focus. But these are two specific studies that we want to undertake within the next year that would specifically benefit wildlife across the agency spectrum. I just want to mention there is some new research-based guidance. There's what's known as a visitor use management. It's a planning framework the federal and state land management agencies have been using for the last few years. And this is a way for them to essentially develop management plans that really meet their stated and specific objectives. Just this year in March, Dr. Jeff Marion, who's a recreation ecologist with the U.S. Geologic Survey, wrote a new chapter for this visitor use management document, specifically looking at impacts to wildlife and managing visitors and managing resources to protect wildlife. And this is some great work, but Jeff's also identified some gaps in the literature. And so that's where we, the center, hope to start to backfill some of these gaps, not only to inform leave no trace efforts, but to help our land management partners. I mentioned that there was some studies a couple of studies that have been done on the effectiveness of leave no trace at actually changing behavior, improving resource and social conditions. This is a study that was done in Zion National Park. The upshot of this study, they're specifically looking at, could we influence people's wildlife feeding behavior through an educational intervention? The big upshot from this was there were statistically significant improvements documented under the treatment conditions, which led to reductions in wildlife feeding. The leave no trace focused messaging was effective at influencing visitor behavior in parks. So through leave no trace messaging, we're seeing less people feeding wildlife in parks. This is a great study, but we need more of these with different types of wildlife, different types of parks, to ensure that our message is as effective as it can be. So here are some strategies that are making a difference just broadly that are being utilized currently to address wildlife-related impacts. One of those is just simple documentation of baseline conditions via monitoring to determine success metrics. We're advocating the use of citizen science. Because of people's interest in wildlife, it's easy to engage them in citizen science efforts to help gather that baseline data regarding wildlife. Another one is having a data-driven approach to educating outdoor enthusiasts about how they can minimize their individual but cumulative impacts on wildlife. Generally speaking, the better data we have, the better messaging we can create to actually meaningfully influence decisions and behavior on the ground. Another one is just having engaging, cohesive messaging, like those examples I showed from the National Park Service, particularly social media, but also things like websites and on-site signage, as well as maps, guidebooks, and other ways that we reach people. The more we can engage people in those types of messages, perhaps the better retention they'll have, and that could actually influence behavior. And the last one is infrastructure investments. We've got to have better infrastructure in some of our parks. For example, we're seeing a lot of issues with hanging bear bags now. Places like New York State, for example, in the Adirondacks, in the High Peaks area, you're no longer allowed to hang bear bags. You're required to use bear canisters. And so we're seeing that movement from more, let's say, traditional food storage methods change over time to more infrastructure-based methods. So provided bear lockers, food storage lockers in the backcountry, those types of things that are really more effective and take the human error out of properly storing food in many cases. So some final thoughts. There are simply more and more of us trying to enjoy the same finite space. If you recall some of those numbers at the outset, we've got 330 million annual visits to national parks, almost 800 million annual visits to state parks. We're all trying to enjoy the same finite spaces, and many of the places we're trying to enjoy are prime wildlife habitat. You know, much of the impact that we see in parks and protected areas is not malicious intent. People don't just generally wake up and sort of yawn and say, how can I, hurt a park today? How can I harm the environment today? It's generally a lack of knowledge. In many cases, it's just ignorance. People just don't know the best thing to do to protect wildlife. And so we're dealing with ignorance, not necessarily malice. We need research to ensure a true understanding of visitors' views about wildlife in park and protected areas is critical. The more we know, the more we can respond to people's perceptions and really create strong, effective messaging and outreach. And the last one is just, we're seeing where a data-driven approach can be a real game changer in terms of influencing outdoor enthusiasts regarding not only impacts broadly, but specifically wildlife. The more data we have, the better we can be with all of our output. So with that said, I will turn it back over to Dana, and we will entertain some questions.
That's right, correct. So we will open up the floor now for any questions that folks have on Ben's presentation, specifically focused on wildlife or general Leave No Trace questions. And as everyone knows, I believe you can send your question in, just typing it in the chat mode, and we will receive questions that way. And here's one that's come in. What resources does Leave No Trace have for land managers looking to reduce human-wildlife conflicts?
Well, it depends on the wildlife in question. If we're talking about more of the megafauna, bison, bears, wolves, mountain lions, that would be a different suite of information that we would have for, say, a national park in South Florida, for example, that's dealing with alligators and small mammals. So we do have resources. It really depends on two things. Number one, what wildlife species we're talking about, and two, what issues we're talking about. If it's things like proximity to wildlife versus wildlife feeding or wildlife harassment, we would have some different messaging that we could provide to them, but we would start with the best available science. We would couple that with the best available messaging, and then we would work specifically with those managers to tailor messages to best address the issues they're facing.
Great. Okay, and here's another. Are there specific citizen science opportunities that are currently available from the center?
There are some. We are building citizen science into our hotspots for 2020, and so we've just unveiled the 2020 hotspot schedule. And so it's quite likely that there will be an opportunity for citizen science within each of those. We did just recently release a citizen science toolkit for people who are interested in utilizing the platform that we've been developing with citsci.org. And so I'm not aware of any current citizen science efforts between now and the holidays. That said, early in 2020, we will start to roll out citizen science efforts that are available through the Hotspots program and other efforts that we have that are popping up in places like Buffalo River, which is a unit of the National Park Service. It's a national river. So we have some efforts that are not necessarily associated with hotspots, but I would look for a more comprehensive suite of those early in 2020.
Great. Okay, Ben, a few more. I remember hearing about reduced human-wildlife conflicts in Yosemite specifically. Do we know how they accomplished that reduction?
There were a couple things that Yosemite has done over the years that have worked really well. For one, they outlawed bear bag hangs specifically. They've required canister use. They make canisters widely available in Yosemite Valley. They have done significant educational efforts. We're talking really strong efforts to educate visitors in not only the front country and their campgrounds, but also certainly backcountry and wilderness users. And it has very much been a comprehensive effort. It wasn't just the wildlife managers, it wasn't just interp and ed or interpretation and education folks in the park. It was really more of a park-wide focus on reducing human-wildlife conflict. Additionally, there has been a lot of good research done in Yosemite. There are a couple of studies done on bear canister usage by backpackers. They took a theory-driven approach to looking at how to better influence the usage of bear canisters. They also looked at some backcountry food storage things in Yosemite that could make a difference in terms of just reducing that human-wildlife conflict. So it was really, I would say, if you had to tease out one element of their overall effort, it was just how comprehensive that effort actually was. It wasn't just this, we found this sort of a silver bullet, it was more of a silver buckshot approach. We're going to try a variety of things to really better reach visitors to Yosemite National Park about bear issues.
Great. Let's take a few more questions. Let's see. What are challenges to obtaining funding for research projects, or what's the likelihood that some of the research projects might get funded?
You know, the challenges are, for one, the center is not positioned to compete for federal research dollars like an academic institution. There are entities known as Cooperative Ecosystem Studies Units. They're referred to as CESUs. The center is not party to any one of the 16 or 17 CESUs around the country, and there are very few NGOs that are involved in the CESUs. The CESU is a system set up where the federal government has a pot of research funding that can be competed for by entities that are included in these CESUs, predominantly academia. So for us to find federal funds is very challenging. We have been very successful in many cases finding private money to fund our research efforts. The advantages to finding money that's not federal is that there are many conditions on doing research on federal lands that are required if you're using federal funding. When you have private money, there are a lot less hoops to jump through in terms of research permit availability. So funding, it's challenging in some ways that we really aren't suited to compete for federal funds. I'd say the biggest challenge from our side is just identifying funders who have a particular interest in this case, in specifically wildlife issues. And so it's just a matter of making sure that we're matching the right potential funding source with the research. And we do have a suite of research opportunities that we'd like to act on. These are the two that are really focused on wildlife. So we just have to match the funder with the research that we're interested in. The other real beneficial piece to us having private money is that we can direct the research agenda, and we can best meet the needs of our land management partners because we can find out exactly what they're interested in, we can couple that with private funds, and we really stay in the driver's seat in terms of the research questions.
Okay, excellent. And in light of time, I'm going to take one more question, and that is, are there more wildlife issues or conflicts today, or are we just hearing more about them because of the ongoing news cycle?
I think that's a great question. I would argue that if you were to survey 10 land managers, I would say 9 out of 10 would likely say that there are actually more wildlife issues because there are more people. I would also say that there is certainly more opportunities to hear about those issues, but I think fundamentally the increase in visitation in parks has put more people in proximity with wildlife than we've ever seen. And the rise of social media and people wanting to get that shot for Instagram or their other social feeds, that has driven people to make decisions that do impact wildlife inadvertently, and they may not know the consequences of those decisions. But I think, particularly, for example, when we look at the data, we survey our land management partners every 2 years, and we're about to run our 2020 land manager survey. And when you look at the top issues, wildlife is usually in the top 5 or 10 issues for all parks that we survey. And this is Park Service, Forest Service, BLM, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Army Corps, state entities, municipal entities. And so I think that increase in visitation is leading to increases in human-wildlife conflict and wildlife issues in parks and protected areas.
Excellent. I want to thank Ben for taking the time to present this fascinating, super relevant information today. And Before I close, or as I close, I want to remind everyone that many of you know we are celebrating our 25th anniversary. And in celebration of 25 years, again, this is Dana Watts speaking, I'm the executive director here. I want to bring to your attention a new fund that we have created specifically for kids, and it's called our Nature Keeper Fund. And the goal is to really connect kids to nature with an ethic of caring. Some of the research we know and that tells us is that kids who spend more time outside have higher levels of fitness, lower anxiety, stronger bones, and there are so many benefits not only to kids and to youth today, but also to the land itself and instilling that ethic at an early age. We've created this fund, the Nature Keeper Fund, with a bold goal for next year of reaching 500,000 new kids with Leave No Trace. The good news is we already have a pledged amount of $75,000, and we're looking for others to join and really build this fund for future generations. It's an interesting format for the fund, which is a 5-to-5 pledge, so a $5,000 annual donation that is committed for 5 years. Again, we're super excited about this. If anyone is interested, please call me directly and I can give you more detail and how you might get involved. And once again, I just want to say thank you to you for your support, your volunteerism, your dedication to this cause, this big, bold conservation effort that is Leave No Trace, and is more important today than it's ever been. So thank you. One other note, we will send you a copy of the webinar, and it'll be emailed to you, so you will have all of this in detail. And once again, thanks so much. Everyone have a wonderful Thanksgiving.